Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better? Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Hosmer, professor and head of the OSU History Department, and your host for this episode. We're joined today by Sarah Kirk, currently Fulbright Teaching Associate Rheinland-Pfalz, Germany. Sarah is a product of our program at OSU, graduating in May of 2023. In her time at OSU, Sarah distinguished herself as a superior student and university citizen. She earned multiple awards, including but not limited to our Outstanding Senior. We're delighted to report that she's accepted a place in the MA program in art history at the University of Illinois, and we're really, really proud of you. So welcome to Good History, Sarah, and so nice to see you again. Let me begin by asking you to tell us about yourself and how you ended up in Germany as a Fulbright scholar.
So I'm very excited to be on this podcast and speaking with you, Dr. Hosmer. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so Oklahoma has always been very near and dear to me. Fell in love with history when I was younger, just interested in finding answers to questions, mysteries of the world. Went to OSU as a history major, came in knowing exactly what major I wanted to be. And around my second year, I thought I would love to go back to Germany. I'd already been there before, so I applied for a Fulbright teaching associate position and got to come back to Germany as a Fulbright scholar. So I'm very excited to be here across the Atlantic.
Indeed, joining us across the Atlantic. So you just mentioned that this wasn't your first excursion abroad or even to Germany. So tell us a little bit about that earlier trip and how it may have inspired a second one. When did you first think about traveling abroad, in fact, and in what context?
So I had never actually left the United States before I went to Germany when I was younger. I had always wanted to travel internationally, and I had been at the same school system since kindergarten. So I kind of wanted a little bit of a change. And growing up, I grew up with a single mother. So that's part of the reason why we never got to travel as much and didn't have any of the funds needed for study abroad programs like Rotary Club or things like that. And when I was doing my research into study abroad, I found the CBYX program, which is the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange. And it's a fully funded scholarship, jointly funded through the US Congress and the German Bundestag, which allows 250 American students to go to Germany for a year and the same 250 German students to come to the US. And so I got to go to Germany. I spent a year there, stayed with a host family for a year, went to a German gymnasium, and that definitely facilitated part of my love for history and really made me interested in objects and people and places.
So you were actively researching, looking around for study abroad opportunities that were affordable, right? Is that kind of how this was working, right? So tell me, so how did you start doing that? Where did you look? What did you do to find these various opportunities?
Just online, that's the best part of my generation is everything is at our fingertips. Looking at different study abroad programs. I didn't have a specific country in mind, which helped a lot. And I just stumbled across the CBYX program. It was talked about, they had their website. It listed out the requirements and said that it was fully funded. And I jumped at the opportunity, organized everything, and it was quite an extended process, very similar to Fulbright, actually. I had to submit all of my application materials, letters of recommendation, and then had to drive to OKC after I was nominated as a semifinalist to interview for it. And then after that, about a month later, I got an email saying I was a finalist and was selected for the program.
Fantastic. So was this in high school or when you were in college that you did this
Yeah,
first
this was
trip?
high school. So
Wow.
I was a junior in high school. I was 16, turned 17 in Germany, and it was mainly oriented towards high school students. So
Yeah. Did you have help at your high school to do it, or did you just do most of this on your own?
I did most of it on my own. There were, of course, I'm so thankful for my teachers who wrote letters for me. There was a couple hiccups when I got back regarding transcripts, but
Uh,
we eventually got that resolved. There was a change of administration, and so some promises that had been made were
uh,
now up in the air, but it all got
mm.
resolved, so I'm thankful for that. Of course, my mom helped, she was very supportive. She said she was scared for me to go at 16 to a foreign country for a year, but I'm really glad that she said that I could and gave me that opportunity.
Yeah, I give her a lot of credit as a parent. I can appreciate the nervousness and anxiety that would follow that, but also the real joy in seeing your child reach for something beyond themselves. So that's really fantastic. So it may go without saying that traveling abroad involves exposure to and ruminations about and making sense of history. So when you've traveled, how does history figure into both the experience and maybe how you make sense of it as you move through it?
I've always been interested in history since I was younger. As I said, just questions about the world, questions about the past. I've always found things and people from yesteryear very interesting. And so when I travel, I love to go to museums. I'm one of the museum people. But also I just love to walk around and, take in the scenery, whether that's Tulsa or Florence or Germany. And just seeing how history and how, the past continues to inform the present. Even if you decide not to go to a museum and you prefer more mainstream entertainment when you travel, the layout of the city and the culture of the city is all informed by the past. And so I think history when traveling is present in every regard, whether people realize it or not.
Nice. History's all around us, right? And in us and through us too, which is kind of
Mhm.
cool to think about. So, at this point in your young life, how do you assess the importance of travel?
Oh, I think travel is very important. I partially am quite a homebody. I love to stay at home, but I also think traveling and getting as many experiences as I can as quickly as I can is very important. And it all depends on your budget and your opportunities. And so I'm privileged and very thankful that I've had so many opportunities to travel in my life. And when presented with an opportunity, I really capitalize on it and try to make the most of it. I think especially young people should see as much of the world as they can within reason. Don't go into debt.
Hmm. But it's made a difference in sort of just the way you think about your place in the world and what you want to do as you move forward through your studies or whatever.
Definitely. It's definitely helped me see just how wide the world is. Was born and raised in Tulsa, and as I mentioned, had never left the country before Germany. I had traveled somewhat in the United States, but Oklahoma was my extended home. That was where I spent most of my time, most of my life. And so being able to go to Germany and go to different countries has made me realize that it's completely feasible to move wherever I would like to move and to start a new life or to go back home and continue my life there. It's
That's a great
it
way to look at it, right?
yeah.
Yeah, a real confidence booster, level of comfort with the world around you, and recognizing that you can just uproot and go some other place and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's big, right? So you studied history along with other fields at OSU, and maybe you can kind of reflect on the discipline of history, sort of where this interest comes. You've talked a little bit about this already, but maybe think about it even a little bit more deeply, where this love of and interest of history comes from. Reading, popular culture, teachers, professors, right? Where did you feel like the seed or seeds were planted?
Ever since childhood, I've had this love for history and this passion for learning. When I was a baby, my mom would even enroll me as an infant in the Tulsa summer reading program at the Tulsa Library. And she would take me and she would read books, and that's what she would document. And so, always learning. Growing up in Tulsa, I was interested in Tulsa history, going to the library, spent much of my childhood at the library, spent a lot of time in Girl Scouts, so I was became interested in Girl Scouts. I actually had the opportunity to take a trip to Savannah and see the Juliet Gordon Low House. So, just a bunch of opportunities, and I think nearly everything in my life informed my interests now. When I was very young, my family and my entire family, my mom, my grandma, my grandpa, they really loved the NCIS television show. And I was convinced for the longest time, since I was probably about 6 years old, that I wanted to be a forensic scientist, to the point that my mom even organized a Girl Scout trip to the forensic lab, OSU's forensic lab in Tulsa. And so I got to go and see the different equipment and everything. And I am definitely no longer, I admire science. I'm definitely not interested in a career in science anymore. But I think what informs that is, this interest in mysteries and in solving things and finding
Yeah.
answers to certain things. Throughout high school, middle school and high school was, I found history more and became more interested in it. In sixth grade, my school made us do a unit on ancient Rome. So became
Nice.
interested in that, just be slowly being introduced to different, you know, fields of history, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and was interested in archaeology. Again, this finding answers, discovering things. And now I prefer the books and I prefer research, but I find that it's quite the same thing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. A couple things that come to mind. One is more of an observation or a shout out, and I want to make sure that we offer our compliments to your mom. Pretty impressive, right? I mean, I think that's outstanding. Just the way you describe her and the role that she played. So big shout out to your mom. Secondly, so as you move through classes in archaeology and forensics and you're at OSU, and so what kind of role did your professors play in this kind of discovery?
At OSU, I am so thankful for all of my professors and for the history department. It is so incredibly dynamic and so hands-on. This is a shout out to the OSU history department. And the professors that I found, they really helped me find what specific area I was interested in and really allowed me that freedom to discover what not just the area of history and the era, but specific questions regarding history. When I was Luckily, when I was in high school, my senior year after I came back from Germany, I took concurrent classes at TCC, Tulsa Community College. And so when I came to OSU, I had most of my gen eds done.
Hmm.
And I am really happy that I did that because freshman year, I was taking 3,000 level history courses. And I definitely think that helped me keep from burning out, that kept my love for history and my interest for history and my involvement in the history department going and kept it strong. I took several classes, ancient and medieval, with Dr. Emily Graham, a member of the OSU history department, and was just able to find my way and find the area. And so professors were not just a tool for education and just there to help me grow and to help me learn, but to inspire. I think that's one of the most important things that they do is encourage students to reach higher. So thankful most of my professors that I had wrote letters for graduate school and for my Fulbright program. And so I'm so thankful for them and thankful for the opportunities.
Well, that's great. What a beautiful answer. So, what else did you study at OSU? And I ask that because I'm interested in seeing how non history classes informed your study or interest in history, and maybe the other way around, right? And how did you begin to kind of assemble these pieces? I think I know a little of the answer when you're talking about forensics and archaeology, but maybe you can
Mhm.
kind of describe that a little bit, right? How you started assembling all of this?
Yeah, so I was able to minor in ancient and medieval studies and then European studies. So, of course, I had a lot of history courses, but as well as English and, of course, art history. I never minored in art history, but took several classes and honors seminars. And history has its own methodology, which does differ depending on which area you are, whether you're modern or antiquity. But I find that there's a tradition throughout. And so, depending on these different subjects, English versus art history versus history, the methodology does change. And I think they're all very similar. I think they can all be considered, they're all one humanity, but they all have their different methodology and they all have their different interests and their different way of going about discovering things. So during my time in undergrad, I was able to take these different courses and take these different approaches and kind of assemble them into one. Again, I didn't minor in art history, but my undergraduate thesis, I tried to combine art history and history. So I took the more analytical approach of history, the numbers and the data. And I've always thought of history as a humanity with numbers, right? And art history is more about impression and what you think of certain things and what you can interpret from certain things. And so I was able to combine those two. And I hope to continue to do that in my research.
Nice. It seems like some of this approach also derives from what you were describing earlier, this kind of childhood play, the entertainment you consumed, your subsequent studies, right? You're talking a lot about, right, exploring and discovering and researching and investigating, right? So as you describe this, right, those pieces, am I right in thinking that those pieces and those practices kind of come together and help you assemble the various streams of thought and studies that you've encountered?
Yeah, definitely. I think whether it's myself or anybody else, I think most of us are informed by things that we experience in childhood. We grow from that, or sometimes we're even hindered by certain things that happen, but they all shape us into what we are and what we find interest in.
Yeah, great answer. So, when I think about your travel to Europe, where you are now, and your previous travel, and where you're going to head to do some, I think, personal travel as you move forward and think about art history and archives, it seems that you're interested in objects, right? Interested in objects and what they tell us. Can you tell us a little bit about how you engage kind of material culture or the objects around you?
Yeah, so I grew up going to museums. I've worked in museums before, and so I find not only my own experiences, but seeing the way that other people interact with objects and art to be incredibly interesting. And I think it's quite informative. And when I go about my life and I go about my research, I would like to consider that and consider the effect that it can have on individuals and thus on society as well.
That's a great segue to where I wanted to go next, as it turns out. So, I wanted to ask you a little bit about connections that you see between studying history and art history and things like community service or engagement with your community and outreach, and how those pieces are starting to come together for you.
Yeah, I think history is all about the public and all about the people, whether that's a more academic approach, reading books, people being able to learn from that, learn from the past, or the fields of public history where we're actively renovating or restoring is a better word, restoring these older buildings and these historic buildings or reenactments of different things, making history living. There's living history museums and then regular history museums where, the objects are behind a pane of glass. They still can inspire people to think about history and think about the past. And so I think that history is just so important for people and just finding their place in life and being able
Yeah.
to, you know, figure out what they want to do.
And the connection between the academic study and just outreach, community service, or the way we interact with one another. So how has being in Germany kind of had informed that thinking between, or that those connections that you're making between the academic study of history and this kind of outreach, engage set of activities and orientations that you're describing?
Yeah, so it's very much informed the way that I'm an English teaching assistant. So the way that I go about approaching the classroom and approaching the students, I've tried to include discussions of art history, visual learning techniques, things like that. And it can spark conversation, spark dialogue, and just encourage connection as well. And this community outreach and building connections with others. There's a As well as the town that I live in, there's a castle, Schloss Sinzig. And so being able to go there and just see what the community itself is doing and kind of being on the outside of it for once and just looking in and seeing that. And learning from that. And when I come back to the US, I hope that, my experiences and how community outreach affect history and vice versa, continue to explore that.
In that example that you've offered, have you observed differences between tourist groups, the ways people from different cultures or different countries engage that same place? Kind of interesting, right? You're the same object seen by people or experienced by people from different cultures, and then you watch that. So what is it that or are you gaining something from that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think, the difference between locals and tourists when engaging in whether it's architecture or historical objects is so interesting because history is all around us. And at one point, it becomes it becomes normal. It becomes digestible. Growing up in Tulsa, historic Route 66, that's completely normal. I don't even think about it on the daily. And so I've noticed here in Germany, the locals will just walk past the street. They don't sometimes don't even turn to look at the building because they see it every single day. And yet the tourists, they stop and they take photos because, it's something new. And so I think it's just so interesting. And even me, having only been here for a year, when I first saw it, I was a tourist. I stopped and looked at it. But now sometimes when I'm in a rush, I just walk right by it. And so it's amazing how quickly humans are able to digest history and just it's all around us and we just accept that.
That's really fascinating, right? And there are all kinds of stories and experiences or cliches that one can attach to that. I mean, one of the sort of more famous ones is people who live in Manhattan who've never been to the Statue of Liberty, right? There's sort of a whole
Mhm.
discourse about those sorts of things, and I think we've all experienced some of that. But I like what you just described. Not only this distinction, but it's not really ignoring that incredible object that tourists find interesting. It's just that it becomes part of your sort of everyday experience and kind of integrated in your daily life, right? I mean, and
Yeah.
and so that's really, I think that's really intriguing, right? To sort of imagine and think about, right? I grew up on the ocean and occasionally go back and visit, and I'm kind of struck by that as well. And think about when I was growing up. When I visit now, I'm incredibly excited. I want to walk on the beach and do other sort of things. And when I was growing up, I would like it was just there, right?
Mhm.
The beach was just there, and
Yeah.
so that's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
completely understand that. Growing up in Oklahoma, of course, landlocked, the first time I saw the ocean was Florida. We had driven down, we were in Fort Lauderdale. It was the middle of the night, and I insisted on going and seeing the ocean. It's dark, and I just go into the water. And so I can't even imagine if I lived near the ocean, would I'm sure, the first couple weeks or the first couple months, every day at the beach, seeing it, enjoying it. And then eventually it might become just a fact of life, just another thing,
Right.
another opportunity that you can engage with or not engage with because it's just there.
Y- That's really great. Yeah, it's a really good example. So, does your mom read history? Does your mom study art?
Not really. I think she
Interesting.
finds it interesting. Of course, as I mentioned, she took me to the Philbrook, so she was there, she was engaging with it alongside me, but she's not as bookish as I am. She says that when she was pregnant and when I was a baby, she would play Mozart for me, and she says, according to her, that's how I got so smart. And I was like, "Mom, I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I think it's more so the way that you encouraged me, reading books to me and
Mm,
encouraging me to read and encouraging me to learn." She never had she definitely did not have as many opportunities as she afforded me, and she's always told me that that was one of her goals in life was she wanted me to have things that she never had, and I think that I'm not a parent, but I can imagine that most parents think that way. They want as much as they want as many things for their children as they can have.
yeah.
So, she doesn't engage with history or art as much as me, but by default of having a history major as a daughter, she has to engage it somewhat. So,
Nice.
she listens, and whether she finds it annoying or not, which I'm sure she does at some points when I go on certain rants, she's hearing about it and it's kind of part of her life.
Yeah. And as far as, being studying history, it's an occupational hazard to just start talking about it, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it just happens, right? So,
definitely.
oh, by the way, I know something about that.
Mhm. Like,
So, yeah,
trivia,
go ahead.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like trivia or it's like fun
Yeah.
facts about anything or politics get brought up and, "Well, did you know that this?" And,
Oh, yeah.
about how history informed this specific belief or this specific law. Yeah, history,
Right.
again, is everywhere.
Right.
And we as history majors, as historians, we always are engaging with it very actively, but I think everyone, whether they're a historian or not, is also engaging with history
Yeah.
inactively, unconsciously.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a really great answer. So you entered OSU at the front end, I guess you could say, of the pandemic. And
Mhm.
so when maybe you've had time now to reflect that unique experience, particularly since you're in school face to face and sort of moving toward a more, I suppose, typical pre-pandemic experience, whatever that is. Do you have thoughts on how entering college at a pandemic may have influenced your studies, your pathway, maybe the way you think about your career path?
Yeah, I think it has informed and affected me in my life just by default of beyond me, the different inventions that came out of it, the rise,
Hmm.
the increase in the use of Zoom and online meetings, the increase of AI, which is such a hot topic now. So I definitely think it has affected the world around me and, the career that I'll be able to achieve. And coming into college, it informed my college life. Of course, you have this idea of college, whether it's from your parents or from movies. And coming into college, I did stay in a dorm, but most of my classes were online or hybrid. There was less community to begin with, but also a different version of community. There was an increase in I got involved with the history club, for example, and rather than meeting in person, we met online on Zoom. And so it was again just another way to show that different there's a variety of different opportunities. There's different ways to engage with
Mhm.
your community or with the public or with history, with learning. So yeah, it definitely affected me, and I'm sure it affected the entire world, 7 billion people, and changed the world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as historians, we're going to be grappling with this for quite a long time, right? And trying to really put our finger on what changed, what didn't, right? And particularly as the experience kind of recedes a little bit to memory, it's so much less present in our lives, and it becomes this sort of historical event that will be intriguing too, right? Particularly for historians, right? People who like history. What the heck was that, right?
Yeah,
What happened? What
definitely.
happened?
Yeah, definitely for historians and even for maybe, it affected so many people, but the people who might remember it more vividly because of the way that it affected them, such as for my generation, when you think about things historically, I feel every generation has a specific event. This is what they say. Every generation has a specific event that they remember. They know exactly where they were when it happened. For example, my grandma says that she remembers exactly where she was when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, when she learned about that. My mom knows exactly where she was and what she was doing when she heard about 9/11 on the news. And for me, I know exactly where I was when I won't say when COVID-19 began, but I guess when we realized as a country the severity of it and realized that we needed to react to it. It was spring break. I was in Texas visiting friends, actually friends that I had met on CBYX, funnily enough, and got an email from my school saying that break is extended by 2 weeks. I never went back to my high school after that.
Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah. Just,
That's huge.
this big, like, watershed event that happens each generation, and I think it's affected so many different things, as you mentioned, and, historians and politicians and the average person are gonna grapple with it for years of how it affected certain things, how it
Right.
affected the economy, how it affected the way that we simply engage with one another. So many different things.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's really intriguing, isn't it? An example of history being all around us, but also the
Yeah.
difference between living in the moment and then having, some distance and perspective. And I think that's an interesting part of the equation too.
Yeah, definitely.
So where are you going next? So tell us a little bit about why you chose an MA in art history and why the University of Illinois.
Well, I was really impressed with the MA program in art history at the University of Illinois. Very impressed with their faculty, very impressed with the amount of museums. They are more smaller museums, but there's multiple within Urbana-Champaign, and just how eager they were to engage with students and to encourage students. There was so many different fellowships and so many different ways to grow and ways to explore. And it's about 2 hours from Chicago, still near to one of the major art hubs. And yeah, I'm very excited to go. I'm excited for the opportunities. But yeah, definitely the faculty and simply how they engaged with me and the opportunities that are offered there. Very,
What are you ta-
very
what are you
much.
taking for what are you taking for classes this fall?
I actually haven't registered yet, so
What
that's
do
a
you
little
think you want to
nerve-wracking.
take?
I've looked and there should be a seminar in Italian art that's offered, so of course I'm gonna take that.
Yes.
And then more than likely theory and methodology.
Great.
Yeah.
That sounds wonderful. Yeah.
Very
You're
much,
gonna you're
yeah, a segue, something I'm already interested in, and then, the introductory level class for graduate studies. Definitely.
Yeah, no, that sounds perfect, right?
Mm,
And really really exciting. You're gonna love it.
yeah.
Um,
I'm excited.
s- yeah. You should be. So we're going to move to a little bit of a different segment of the podcast now, and toward the end, we like to kind of circle back to some of the framing ideas about this podcast. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're really interested, and you guided us through this in this conversation just today about how we make sense of history and how we think about the role and place of studying history and for ourselves, but also for our communities and our country, we might even think, and maybe even more globally. So we'll talk a little bit, a couple of questions about that. And so in our time, and third decade of the 21st century, history and humanities are struggling to demonstrate our relevance and our importance to college students. And I think more generally to the public, we see this all the time manifested in different ways. And we're told that focusing on history is a bad career move and that history majors end up as baristas for the most part. At the same time, and you just referred to this in all kinds of interesting ways, Americans consume history enthusiastically. They buy books, lots of history books. They watch documentaries. They enjoy feature films and also dramas set in historical periods of time. We appeal to history all the time, right? We were just chatting a little bit about this. Think about debates and discussions surrounding contemporary issues and how often we appeal to history for support for our position, right? We will say, well, history tells us, and the lessons of history are X, Y, and Z. And so we appeal to history all the time, right? In these sorts of conversations, we're thinking about it, at least in an abstract way, watching documentaries. So what I want to ask you is what you make of this apparent paradox that history is struggling for oxygen inside universities or when we talk about universities and is immensely popular outside the academy. And as you re-enter the academy, right? What do you make of that? One thing, does that make sense to you? And
Mhm.
number two, what do you make of that?
I definitely agree. I think this paradox does exist where people always seem to question the humanities and question the efficacy and the validity of studying the humanities. And yet at the same time, whether they're reading a book or watching a TV, well, that TV was written by someone. That script was written by someone. That book was written by someone. If you pick up a documentary, well, a historian researched that. And so this paradox does exist. And I think it's quite interesting. I think, just my personal opinion and my personal experiences, I think we've, as a country, almost have tried to prioritize expansion and how quickly we can accomplish different things. And so that's, the rise of the sciences and the maths, which of course are incredibly important for everyday life. I wouldn't want a history major designing a bridge, but but I find that they're both important. But at the same time, I wouldn't want an engineer trying to draft a book about Julius
Right,
Caesar,
right.
or researching that. I find that maybe, and as you mentioned, people are so interested in history, they engage with it so often. Wikipedia, someone's there, someone's writing that, whether it's historically accurate or not, whether someone included something for fun, you're still engaging with writing, you're still engaging with literacy. And so I think the humanities are so incredibly important broadly for all of the skills that they encourage: communication skills, research skills, inter and intrapersonal skills. But then specifically, they're also important just for, you know, if we don't study history or we don't study the literature of the past, what are we going to become as
Mm,
society? I feel that that's what makes us human, very human, is how we hold on to things and how they say, history existed before writing existed, but that's when the study of history began, was when writing was invented.
mhm.
And so just it's so important for everyday life, and especially history and good history. It's so important to be remembered. One of my favorite quotes is by George Santayana, who said
Mm,
that those who cannot remember the past are
mhm.
condemned to repeat it. And I just think that that's so prevalent and so important and continues to be important today. If we can't remember the mistakes that were made, if we can't document the mistakes that were made, then how are we going to learn from them as a complete society?
Yeah, very good. I like what you said about studying history as part of what makes us human. And
Mhm.
and I think that's just such a beautiful way to look at it. I remember reading something when Notre Dame had the devastating fire about that place, the event, and one of the one of the observations was that engineers can explain how the roof was built with all those various timbers and the construction, right, and all those sorts of things. But humanists can try to explain why we care, right? And I thought that was lovely, right? Beautiful,
Yeah.
right? What is it? Why do we even care that this exists at all? And
Yeah,
you
exactly.
just talked about that.
Yeah, as you
Yeah.
said, an engineer can explain how it was built. A scientist could explain why it burns, but someone who studied the past and who cares about the past can tell you why millions of people are sitting around their TV or standing blocks away from it watching it burn and feeling a deep emotional connection to it. And when it's some people might just look at it and be like, it's a building. Why do we care about a building? But it's more than that. And
Hmm.
historians and the humanities are what inform that.
Yeah. That's a wonderful way to look at it, I think. So when you're at gatherings of one sort or another, I imagine you field history questions, right? Of one sort or another. I know that I get them if I'm, at the barber shop or at the dentist and they ask me, they know what I do and they want to talk about history. And usually ask kind of the sort of similar questions, I feel like, over the course of time. But so what I'm asking you to do is think about those gatherings. And if you had to decide or you determined the question that somebody you don't know asks you about history, what would that question be? Or what do you wish somebody would ask you?
So, indeed, I have had experiences as that. I feel it's a universal experience. And I think people ask very, very pointed questions, right? They ask, well, what are you going to do with that? Or, oh, so you want to teach history? And part of me does want to say, well, everyone's teaching history, right? We're learning it every day. But I think if somebody were to ask me a question about history and I had to field a question about history, I think I would want a broader question, right? Maybe a question like, why history?
Yeah.
And so they would be subject to a long tirade as I explain, the things that we talked about on this podcast, why it's important for humanity, why it's important for society, the different things that you can do with it, the different fields that you can go into. It's so vast. And so it's not what about history, but why history.
Love that. Yeah. The why, right? Why study history?
Hmm.
That's a really good question, right? And I think a lot of us would love to expand upon that, right? Just as you did. Well, thank you so much for that. That's a wonderful way to close out this podcast. Thanks for exploring good history, as it turns out. So, on behalf of the Good History team, my colleague, Dr. Sarah Griswold, who's the creative force behind our podcast, Christina Rogers, a PhD candidate in our department who manages episode research and preparation, and Jesse Ulrich, Chief Executive of Rant 9 Productions. He's also the Good History producer and a trained historian, which kind of makes our point about this podcast and history being everywhere and showing up just all sorts of places. And so we want to close with this piece of wisdom. Remember, the only bad history is the history we don't know. So thank you again, Sarah. It's so wonderful to see you and reconnect with you and listen to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.